Technological and societal progress in fantasy is something surprisingly rare. Many fantasy worlds and settings stagnate at a certain point in time for several millennia without much real change, especially when compared to the real world, where technological progress and societal change seems to become more and more rapid the closer you get to the current times. I often have to ask myself why people keep the trope of technological stagnation up, why in so many worlds, no matter if literature, TV shows, movies, game worlds or TTRPG settings, there is next to no technological progress at all, despite talking about several thousand years of history. I think it all comes down to three certain aspects: the romanticization of history, and especially the alleged decline or stagnation of the Middle Ages, the need for a myth or a legend that is somewhat connected to the plot or story, and lastly magic, which supposedly replaces the need for technological and societal progress in fantasy settings. And I'm the Worldbuilding Sage, and I do worldbuilding videos, and I help you improve on your setting to make it more realistic. And remember that I'm not speaking against medieval fantasy. I'm speaking against eternal medieval fantasy, where the setting has nothing else, no matter how far you get into the future or the past. The so-called Dark Ages are for some the time between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the High Middle Ages, and for others the time between the same and the beginning of the Renaissance, making it into the entire Middle Ages. The Dark Ages are seen as an era of technological stagnation, and in some cases even regression. An era of societal hold and downfall, where barbarism ruled and the church repressed any form of societal and technological progress, as knowledge was replaced with faith. This is one of the more dramatic definitions of the Dark Ages floating around, and it's completely misleading. The Dark Ages influenced the idea of the Middle Ages for a long time, beginning in the Renaissance with the reconstruction of antique values, architecture, knowledge and culture. People saw the ages that came before as regressive and backwards. Historians in the 19th and 20th century weren't any better in their writings, coining common misconceptions about the Middle Ages and twisting them to such a degree that they stuck until today. The classic fantasy writer sadly wrote right in the middle of this age of medieval understanding and thought, and these writers of course influenced many modern fantasy writers. Admittingly, Tolkien's understanding of the Middle Ages wasn't that bad by any means, and with Tolkien it was much more a romanticization of these times rather than disdain. The elves abandoning Middle-earth and the downfall of their civilization is a reflection of the Roman Empire and their legions leaving the Isle of Britain, followed by the rise of the new Saxon kingdoms. The British romanticized this era a very lot, see King Arthur or Beowulf, but Tolkien dragged this out for a few millennia, from when the decline of the elves to their departure to the west, up until the Age of Humans happened. The Roman legions left during the war against the Visigoths, led by Alaric around 410 AD. The island was self-governed from then on, nominally under Roman rule, while the Saxons were slowly gaining ground. There has been Roman involvement for a while, but according to the Chronica Galicia of 452, the British provinces were under Saxon rule by 441. The departure and conquest of the Roman territories took a time of 31 years, not even one entire lifetime. This is of course might be one of the more commonly well-known societal changes in the Middle Ages, but they happened all over Europe and all over the entire Middle Ages. Sciences and technology didn't stagnate either, especially clerical institutions, ironically, like monasteries, were a fountain of knowledge. People may have been generally less educated overall, but not to a degree of it being a regressive dark age. And don't forget that universities were a medieval European invention after all. So if these dark ages of medieval Europe were nothing but a myth, why did fantasy writers pick this romanticized fantasy of the eternal Middle Ages then? Creating a myth or legend fitting the setting's history on an epic scale, while obviously still having some narrative links to the actual plot of the story, might be another reason. The Song of Ice and Fire and its setting Westeros, a world which very much romanticized the Middle Ages as well, especially its political landscape, but here it's rather its portrayal of myth and history that bothers me. The events of House of a Dragon take place 300 years before the main book series. There's no real visible change in technology or society, however. It is the same ruling dynasty as during the events that started off the main series plotline, and well, we don't see that much on the commoner's point of view either. But of course, 300 years aren't that much. It's a bit odd that everything is so static still, but I won't complain about it. It's a completely fair time frame. But it stops being fair when we take the whole history of Westeros into account. The first men came to Westeros like 12,000 years before the beginning of the story. It is accounted that nobody knows exactly when they came, because they didn't write anything down. But the later invasion of the Andals was between 6 and 2,000 years ago, which is an enormous time frame, especially considering it's known that many houses were founded during that time. Houses that last to the start of the book series, which implies feudal structures and even the same political landscape till the start of the books. 2 to 6,000 years of knightly medieval fantasy. I understand that Martin wanted to ground the houses and the history of Westeros into an age-old system. He wanted these houses to have myth and history long before the blunt dragon incest people came around. But especially when considering that the invasion of the Andals was supposed to be a parallel to the Norman invasion of Britain in 1066, and the main series story is a parallel to the Wars of the Roses, which took place in the late 15th century. It's getting even more ridiculous. That's a time of 400 years, where society and technology progressed in an ever more rapid pace. 400 years that were stretched to a time of 2000 at the shortest, and 6,000 years at the longest, only interrupted by a few dragons and magic, while having an eternal summer. Some might even say magic is the problem. While Westerosi masters are an obvious hoard of wisdom and knowledge, of past and future ingenuity.
Which makes me question even more why there is no progress.
The impact on magic on Westeros is still comparatively low. The Forgotten Realms, on the other hand, is a high magic fantasy setting with several thousand years of medieval history. The fall of Netheril and their flying cities of magic were the peak of society, technology, and magic for humans in Faerun, while the current age is still living in its shadows about 2,000 years after their downfall. Not to ignore the several 10,000 years of history coming before Netheril. I already talked about the Dark Ages a lot, so I won't again, but you see again the similarities there. Besides the downfall of that ancient civilization, there were two cataclysmic events that barely changed things, at least societal things. And everything has been kept roughly medieval. Not even several changes in the pantheon changed that much in society in the end. Many magical phenomena and events happened that might have stirred society into any way, but nothing changed. Magic, living gods that war each other, dragons and other destructive creatures, spell-casting tyrants and heroes. They all might have had a great impact on society and societal change, but nothing did change. Not even on the technological department. I was watching a few of Ed Greenwood's videos on his new YouTube channel the last couple of weeks, and he often talks about about trade between the people, even between magical tyrannical nations like Thay with the Sword Coast. Trade and connectivity between people is arguably the #1 reason on how to kickstart societal and technological change over the years. People interact and exchange knowledge and new goods and ideas with one another. Conditions that prevent you from gaining certain goods or materials needed for certain technological ideas are negated through trade with other regions. Religions, cultural phenomena and ideas spread and might only be stopped when completely shutting off your country. Medieval Japan is probably one good example of what happens if you don't trade and keep yourself closed off from the outside world. From the early 17th century to the mid 19th century, Japan was isolated, which made the later opening with grand overwhelming cannon fire possible in the first place, due to technological stagnation. But even then, Japanese culture evolved too. But on the Sword Coast, nobody secluded themselves like that. On the contrary, trade is obviously one of the things Ed Greenwood thinks of the most, and the only reason I ever find is that magic keeps it stagnating. While I personally think that magic and magical phenomena should be progressing society instead of regressing society. In conclusion, I think the most prevalent reason why people draw out their setting into an endless medieval age is a certain romanticization of the Middle Ages, and especially medieval fantasy. Endless Middle Ages are both a staple of fantasy because it's always been like that and because people just like the vibes and age. I have nothing against a setting taking place in medieval fantasy, but I really don't understand why people let their setting's entire history revolve around this vibe, without much implication of technological or societal progress inside. In my opinion, this is a fatal error. It takes away from any fantasy setting and leaves me questioning what purpose even the story taking place right now might have, if nothing, and especially society, won't change after the story's events anyway. Any story of the most epic proportions is just becoming dull if everything stays the same it was in the end. And fantasy is sadly the king of stories where nothing happens in the end. Fantasy represents a weird romanticization of stagnation, a conservative notion that the current thing is the best and shouldn't be changed. Never mind the weird romanticization of monarchy. In many cases, something new in fantasy feels like a threat, a weird outlier that doesn't fit into the world, that sometimes even has to be eradicated so people can stay in their weird endless medieval idyllic farming lives. And besides the weird conservative vibes this issue brings with it, a stagnating setting just feels less real. A world that changes and evolves with its citizens, its times, ages, and events feels infinitely more realistic. A story taking place in such a world infinitely more immersive. Even the people that really like medieval fantasy, even for those, many of you, I have a solution that fixes my biggest issue with it. Instead of thousands of years of nightly high medieval history, make it into a shorter time frame. There's no way you can fill that much history with actual written content anyway. Our Middle Ages took place in 1,000 years and is infinitely more eventful than any setting history. And even in that time frame, people from the end of it would never think of themselves living in the same age as the ones living at its beginning. Put your myths back into an unknown age and don't date them. Keep their vibes different, or at least imply that the people telling stories of the past are just projecting their current society and vibes onto the past, like they do with so many stories in real life. And that's it for today's video, world builders. I hope you agree with my takes, but no matter if you do or not, leave a comment on what you think about them, and maybe even leave a like and subscribe. See ya!